Learning is important, right?
Yes, exactly. What a bunch of nerds.
Nerd alert.
Right.
Marketing Architects.
Hello, and welcome to the Marketing Architects, a research-first podcast dedicated to answering your toughest marketing questions. I'm Elena Jasper on the marketing team here at Marketing Architects, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rob DeMars, the Chief Product Architect of Misfits and Machines.
Hello, Elena.
We're back with your weekly Nerd Alert. Every week, I'll take a deep dive into academic marketing research and translate its complex ideas into simple, understandable language for Rob, and of course, for all of you. Are you ready to nerd out, Rob?
I brought my buy one, get one free coupon for nerding out, so I'm ready. I'm ready to cash it in. Let's do this.
That's no good here, but it's a nice try. All right, well, let's get into it. As always, we'll link the research we cover in the episode notes. This week, I read, Why Do Brands Cause Trouble? A Dialectical Theory of Consumer Culture and Branding. This is by Douglas Holt, a professor at Harvard Business School. Holt believes brands are facing growing criticism from a counterculture movement. This study explains why it's happening and how it might change the way brands work. He uses a method called dialectical theory to explore how branding and consumer culture interact over time. If you're wondering what a dialectical theory is,
I am wondering that.
And it's simply defined as a way of explaining change by looking at how opposite ideas or forces interact. So it's based on the idea that progress happens when two conflicting things come together, and then their clash leads to something new. And that was the simple version. So if you're still confused, I am too, but I don't know what else to do. So this study is a little complex, and it's not exactly what I thought it was about when I picked it for the episode, but then I got into it and I'm like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But first, Rob, do you think brands still have as much influence on culture today as they did in the past? Or do you think maybe that's changed?
I think brands are no longer in the driving seat for sure. You know, I grew up definitely like 80s and the 90s, and it was very top down in terms of brands being able to make calls and influence culture. You know, Nike would hire Michael Jordan, and then we all kind of followed like lemmings, where now you see so much brand influence happening on, you know, channels like TikTok, where people are having arguments over Popeye's chicken versus Chick-fil-A. And I said Popeyes. I always say
yeah,
Popeyes.
You said
weird.
Popeye is really weird there. I was going to let it go, but
I've been made fun of before for how I say that. So yes, I struggle with the word Popeye.
It's not, that's because it's not the word.
I know it's Popeyes. I can't say it right,
it's
but
Popeyes,
it is.
like Popeye the Sailor.
I know where it comes from, Elena.
You're saying it like
I just
papaya.
can't say it. I know. I've always done that my whole life. I'm sorry. Now I'm saying it on a podcast. I have been mocked.
All right, so you're done?
I'm done.
That's your point of view. Okay, well, Rob, Holt would agree with you. So you're right on the money here that brands are sort of losing some of their cultural power. And this study breaks down why he thinks that brands are actually, they're not just losing their power, they're under fire from what he calls a countercultural movement. So this study looks into the growing backlash against brands in Western societies. Holt argues that brands today are under fire from a countercultural movement that sees them as manipulative and intrusive. His goal is to explain why this is happening by presenting this new theory, a dialectical theory that looks at how brands and consumer culture have evolved together, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in conflict. So he challenges traditional ideas about consumer resistance and offers a different view that traces the history of branding, focusing on contradictions within branding practices that have led to this sort of anti-branding sentiment today. So essentially, he thinks that brands have brought this upon themselves. And he begins by explaining the concept of cultural engineering, which is a term used to describe how brands initially gained power in the mid-20th century. According to Holt, brands like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Nike, like you mentioned, they weren't just selling products, they were creating cultural meanings. So they became symbols of identity, status, and lifestyle. Marketers position their brands as central to the modern American way of life, telling people what to aspire to. And I think your example of Nike and Michael Jordan is perfect. And this gave brands a huge amount of cultural authority. However, over time, this cultural engineering approach started to fall apart. And that's because of internal contradictions. As brands became better at controlling how people saw the world, they also started to face this resistance. People started to see through it, they felt a little manipulated, and they became more critical. especially of powerful brands like Nike and McDonald's, and began questioning what their role is in shaping culture. So Holt then he fast forwards to now, which he calls a postmodern consumer culture. In our era, people are more focused on individuality, personal freedom. We don't want brands telling us who to be. We want to use brands to express who we already are. So he thinks brands are still important, but only if they seem authentic and aligned with personal values. So, Rob, I'm wondering if this feels familiar to you. Have you ever seen a brand, or maybe recently, have you seen a brand take some sort of a social or moral stance and maybe told you what to do and it just didn't seem authentic?
Well, I mean, there's so many examples out there of brands taking moral stances. I mean, I don't need to go into the hoopla around Bud Light and Target and Ulta and even Pepsi. I actually think you see it a lot right now. Obviously, we're in the season of election times, and I think both parties have really done a bad job at co-opting things that feel disingenuous, especially based on previous histories. I mean, on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, kind of swapping their previous, like you said, both sides swapping their previous stances. And
Both the Republicans and Democrats are both major brands. That's,
yeah,
and they both definitely, I think, violated that trust.
yeah, and it does. That's funny. It is very connected to, I think, how people are feeling about marketing and brands too, because you're starting to wonder, like, do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't remember
Right.
what's going on here?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I also feel like this is kind of an easier question because, yeah, we see it a lot. And I don't know if you've ever seen Ricky Gervais. He gave a speech. I think it was at the Oscars. Have you ever seen this speech? He talks about brands within the
No.
speech. You've got, okay, I'm going to send this to you after we finish recording. If you haven't listened to it, you should. He gives a speech and he includes a little funny bit about how companies like Apple, Disney and Amazon, they produce certain kinds of holier than thou content, but then they have all these sketchy labor practices. And he just kind of rips into them in a room where like Tim Cook's sitting in front of him. It's pretty funny. All in good fun, but he's pointing out kind of the differences. And some brands take social stances, but then they don't stand by it within their own business practices. So let's talk about what this author thinks brands can do to respond. So he recommends he actually calls it an ironic and reflexive brand persona. So he thinks that brands could use humor, irony, self-awareness to make it seem like they're not trying too hard to sell. This makes them feel more genuine. So I think we see that sometimes with brands that have done a really good job with social. It like feels more authentic, not so sort of in your face.
More of a conversation.
Yes, exactly. More of a conversation. He also recommends you could align with a subculture or cultural movement, like fashion, music, or sports communities to appear authentic and connected to real life trends. So that might be like Nike sponsoring professional athletes. That feels very connected to what they do as a brand. The third is using everyday settings and unscripted scenarios to seem more real and relatable. I think sometimes you can see that in advertisements that feel just a little bit more authentic versus others. And then he came up with a phrase that I love, which he calls stealth branding. So this would be relying more on influencers, tastemakers, and peers to subtly promote your product. So avoiding like just 100% direct advertising. And one more is about history. So I liked this recommendation too. He said brands like Harley Davidson, Levi's, they do a good job promoting their history of quality and durability to just enhance their credibility. Well, so then we get to the real meat of the study, because he offers these solutions and he believes that they've worked for a while, but there's still like more to improve there. So as more brands use these tactics, consumers are catching up to that too. So they recognize that even an authentic brand are still trying to sell them something. So then he says this is leading to a postmodern backlash. So brands that seem too calculated can provoke just as much resistance as the old heavy-handed cultural engineering techniques. So it's fine. Like some brands are almost going too far in the opposite direction, like trying to not trick consumers, but trying to maybe fit in a little bit too much. So now this is when the study gets a little bit odd. So he thinks brands need to evolve again. So this is a new branding paradigm, and he calls this I'm sorry, like this guy is so smart. I just can't keep up with it.
And he calls this one Popeyes.
He calls it postmodern branding. So this is where it gets a little weird. And I'm like, okay, I don't mean to laugh. It's like, this is a study from Harvard, but I'm just trying to keep up with it. He recommends brands become what he calls citizen artists. So instead of just trying to sell your products or even like playing this role as a cultural resource, brands need to actually contribute meaningfully to society, be more transparent, socially responsible, and make some positive contributions to the world rather than just manipulating cultural symbols for profit. Which, listen, I just want to share my own opinion here before we get to this Rob GPT. I really like this study. I was surprised by it. I think it's interesting. I love how he ties in like the history, the cultural insights. But when he got to postmodern branding, he lost me a little bit. I don't know how practical that is for every marketer. You know, the theory is they're abstract, and some brands, I think, like Cheerios, we don't really need you to be like changing the world. There's some brands that maybe we just need to serve like a need and we don't actually care that much. You think about when a big cultural event happens, you're not waiting to hear from, what would be a good example?
Lucky Charms.
Perfect. You don't really want to know what Lucky Charms thinks. So again, I think focusing on consistent branding, clear positioning, and then delivering measurable business outcomes. I worry if some brands get lost in becoming, a citizen artist. I can feel the eye rolls already coming from the C-suite as you present a plan like that. But Rob, what do you think about the study and then the final recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to chew on. I'm still trying to swallow dialectical or whatever that was. That's quite a word.
Dialectic.
Dialectic. Sorry, dialectic. I definitely can.
Oh wait, it's dialectical. You're right. Sorry.
I already felt stupid. So
yeah, sorry. No, I felt stupid.
I just think this is such a good topic, not just for advertisers, but for companies in general. And I remember hearing, I think, Scott Galloway talk about this point where he's like, if I sit on the board of a chicken sandwich company, my job to shareholders is about chicken sandwiches and not about making statements about social issues or aligning with things just for the sake of aligning with them. And so stick to your knitting could definitely make sense and feel more authentic at the end of the day.
Yeah, agreed. Mark Ritson, I love his perspective on brand purpose. He's not against brand purpose full stop, but he says that brand purpose and like making social statements and cultural statements, it should cost you. Like it might turn off some customers, everybody might not like it. And that's why it should be very genuine to who you are. And you should be doing it because it's who the brand is, who the company is. It aligns perfectly with what you do sell, not just because you're hoping to align with culture or get out some sort of statement. That's when it just doesn't make sense. So let's go to the Rob GPT and see what the Rob GPT could do with this one. All right. Holt's study is like a giant game of tug of war between brands and consumers, where brands used to pull all the strings, but now the consumers are yanking back harder than ever. Just when brands thought they'd mastered the game, the ropes fraying, and Holt predicts they'll need to start playing as teammates, not puppeteers, to stay in the game. And now I'll admit, Rob, when I saw the title of this, I was so excited because I thought it was about like mischievous brands, because the title is Why Do Brands Cause Trouble? And I'm like, oh, perfect. Rob's going to love this. It's going to be about like disruptive branding, marketing. And then I got into citizen artists. So it didn't quite go where I thought it was going to go.
Interesting nonetheless.
That's it for this episode of The Marketing Architects. We'd like to thank Taylor De Los Reyes for producing the show. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, and if you like the podcast, please leave us a review. Now go forth and build great marketing.
I was in a meeting, and I'm like, oh, Popeye's chicken. He's like, what?
Yeah, that was pretty funny.
Popeye? And I'm like, oh, no, I can't say it normal.
Marketing Architects.